Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. My guest is Denver Holt. He's the founder and president of the Owl Research Institute, which would be really cool to hear about. I love owls. I think it's very fascinating. So we're gonna talk about that. So welcome, Denver.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. Tell me a bit about your history. How did you first learn about owls and start to, get interested in working with them?
Well, a long time ago, Richard, in class at the University of Montana, I can't remember, I think it was an ornithology class, and a kid walked in and said his dad had found an owl. He thought it was in a nest. It was a little woodpecker hole in the woods, and a buddy and I went out there to see it, and we found it and also discovered that there was another species of owl in the same tree nesting, highly unusual, pygmy owl and solid owl. We were young, and we thought, oh, this is kind of cool. Not a lot of owl researchers. Maybe we should study them. And of course, being young kids and juniors in college, no one really wanted to help us out. So we skipped all our classes, sat out there, took a bunch of notes and did shifts, published 2, little descriptive papers. And that was it really for me. My friend Billy, he went on to other things eventually. And I just decided, there's not a lot of owl researchers in the world. They're kind of neat. And maybe I can add to it. But also, too, I think, first of all, I was just attracted to the way they looked.
Yeah, they're weird. I went with my family to Japan 6 years ago, and they have the Owl Cafe, and they have all these owls sitting there, and they're sleeping, and then you walk in front of them, and they open one eye, and they look at you, and they look like old men that you've disturbed from sleep with big bristly mustaches. That they look at you very intently. They're really cool.
Yeah, I've heard about those owl cafes. I've seen some photos of them. Ethically, I don't know about it, but
well, that's true. I don't know about if it's if they're treated well. I hope they are, but yeah.
Yeah, but like you said, they're kind of cool looking. And, I would argue that, they're probably the most widely recognized and popular groups of animals in the world. I mean, everyone knows what an owl is. Not everyone knows what a shorebird is or what a vole or a shrew or something like that, but everyone knows what an owl is. Every culture that we can get back into has recognized owls, whether good or bad. And I think there's certain reasons for that. And one of the ones that I think that's kind of really important, and I kind of open many of my talks on this, is, they have a big head. They have a relatively flat face. They have symmetry, the eyes, the nose, the bill, or mouth, ears and ear tufts and funky hairdos. I think there's something about it that kind of look like us. And I think that's one of the attractions with those big eyes. And very often we're attracted to animals with big brown eyes, but the owls have various colors. So there's something about just the attraction. I think it has to do a little bit with that anyway. But whatever it is, everyone knows what an owl is.
I think because they tend to look at you, and a lot of other animals don't seem to do that. Like dogs will look at you. Other animals, like, they know you're there, but they don't really do that. I think people like owls also because they seem to be interactive. They seem to be. I don't.
Yeah, no, actually, sometimes we talk about having staring contests with owls, and you can't outstare them, and so maybe that's it, because they stare right through you. It's not, like when we're working with them, we're handling them and banding them and measuring and do all the, the research things, and they just stare right into your eyes.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know, what have you been studying about owls? Or, do you keep owls? Like, do you, are they pets? Do you have like your research facility where you have homes for them, where they fly in there and you study them? Like, what's your interaction like with them?
Yeah, we're not a rehab facility. Where injured owls or orphaned owls are brought in. We get calls on that. We try to direct people to the appropriate facilities to handle things like that. Primarily, we're, research, education, conservation oriented. I started at the Owl Institute, I don't know how long ago, 30 plus years ago. And even though I've been working on some of the species for 40 years, we're field oriented. That's the big difference in us as a nonprofit, is that we can dictate our own research questions, species, and then we can put the time into it and be field researchers. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself here, but that's just what's going through my mind. When I was, in school back at university a long time ago, one of the things that was pretty obvious to everybody, even though we were young, impressionable students in our 20s, it was fairly obvious that, our professors didn't really get outside very much. The agency biologists that we kind of aspired to be and work for, they didn't go outside very much. And my vision was to be a field researcher. And so I started the Owls to do it with more guts and brains, and, just to be in the field doing long-term research, asking the questions we wanted to do, and not just going out, for like a couple of weeks of the summertime, which is what most people do and most graduate studies are all about. But it was long-term research, large sample sizes, and importantly, conducted by the same researchers over time, because it takes time to become a good researcher. So that was kind of like the pushing point. And I had, worked for some of the agencies as a young kid, volunteered as a young kid, and I just saw the writing on the wall. I'd probably end up behind a desk, and I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to be a field researcher.
So what's unique and interesting about owls that you've learned from working with them directly?
Oh, gosh, so much. The thing that drew me, right away, in addition to just like their really cool looks, was just the adaptations that they've evolved over time to live in various environments. They occur on all continents except Antarctica, and then almost every habitat you can imagine. And within each of those habitats, whether it's a small owl, middle-sized, or large owl species, they've all evolved unique traits to live in that particular habitat. So whether it's a snowy owl living in the Arctic that is white and has evolved this heavily feathering to keep warm, or it's an elf owl in the desert Southwest that's kind of modeled with the habitat it lives in. It doesn't have much feathering on its feet or bill or face or anything to keep cool. Things of that sort. There's owls that live underground, like burrowing owls. There's owls that live on top of the ground, short-eared owls. And there's fishing owls. There's no real carrion eaters, but they cover pretty much everything else. They eat anything from insects to amphibians, reptiles, birds, small mammals to middle large-sized mammals.
Interesting. The calls of the owls are kind of funny. Like I was looking at, I live in Texas, and there's supposed to be one owl, and the call is supposed to be like, who cooks for you? Who cooks for you? I told my wife that. She said,
That's the phonetics of the barred owl. I'm from Massachusetts, even though I'm here in Montana. I live here, so I don't pronounce my R. So that's the barred owl, B-A-R-R-E-D. And that, who cooks for you, with the early naturalists were trying to describe bird songs in general. That's what they came up with for the barred owl. Who cooks for you all? Whereas like a yellow warble was sweet, sweet, I'm so sweet. So it's like, oh. I'm very familiar with barred owls in the Austin area because I have some friends that live down there.
Are there any other owl calls that are really funny or very strange that you can say, like they sound like they're saying X, Y, Z?
No, the barred owl is probably the best example of that. But, there's some just really, really, really pretty, nice songs like the Eastern Screech Owl. We kind of break it down into hooters and tooters. The big ones are the hooters. The little ones are the tooters. I get a little laugh out of that all the talks. But and then there's some whistles and clacks and croaks. But the tooters are some of them are very, very pleasant. Like the Eastern Screech Owl was, it's such a really pleasant song to hear. You're out at night, you're camping, or you're doing surveys or whatever, and you hear that in the distance. Or sometimes when we used to survey for border owls up, snowmobiling 10 to 15 miles on 6 feet of snow in late February, freezing our butts off, you might hear,
Sorry.
Just reverberates throughout the basin, the snow-covered basin below you. So, that's kind of cool. And, and so I've gone out and done the owl surveys, most of my career, where we devise these methods, and then we go out in the woods, and you may hike, you may cross-country ski, snowmobile, four-wheeler, etc., to get back to some of these areas, and then go out and listen for the owl calls. Sometimes you play a sequence of tapes, other times you just listen. Today we use these automatic recording units that, do it for you. I'm not as crazy about that. I'd rather go out there, but anyhow, it's helpful. And so, and that's how we kind of locate them. And then if they're in that same spot on your survey route for, several times during the onset of the courtship period, then that's when you go in and you start to try to find their nests.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
What happens when you're near an owl in the wild? Are they naturally afraid of people? Are they curious about them? Are they hard to study?
They're hard to study. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Most of the species are hard to study, and with exception. Usually if you're out doing a survey, and our protocol is a protocol of listening first before we try to elicit a response, like a tape recorder or whatever, device we have. Yeah, they're just on their own. At the onset of the breeding season, it's generally speaking, it's, males trying to attract females. So you have a lot of hooting and tooting and whistling going back and forth. And so if we don't hear anything and we are in suspected areas or along the survey route, then we'll use some kind of recording device to play the species that we're interested in to see if we can elicit response to see if they're there. They're pretty forgiving, group of animals to work with. So when we go out there and play the songs, they might come in and look at you. They might come in and hoot or toot back at you. There's a lot of things that can go on, but they're kind of easygoing, hard to find, hard to work on, particularly for long periods of time, but kind of easygoing, unassuming. Some of them, you capture them and they'll just sit in your hand and just stare at you. Others are a little more feisty, but for the most part, they're pretty easygoing group of birds. But that can change, though. The bigger ones can be a little more aggressive if you're at the nestleads.
Are there any that are suitable as pets, or should they never be pets for people?
I mean, my personal view is they should never be pets. They're wild animals. But I think that there's a really good place for them as education birds. So birds that get injured for some reason and they go to a rehab facility, then rehabbers will often, if everything works out where the bird can survive and be trained somewhat, then they use them for owl education programs. And, and I think that's a great use of them. But as far as the owl cafe, having one in your backyard or in your house, I can't say I support that, but, there are people who have done that and people that I've talked to have done that. And I've actually learned quite a bit about the owls through talking to the people who have had them as kind of like, quote, pets.
We have some in, it's okay. Yeah, no, we're in Austin, Texas. Like you said, some people here. In our yard, I hear them at night sometimes. I don't know where they are. I can't see them, but I hear them. So they're not really pets, but they're around our house. So I'm like, okay, great,
Yeah, a lot of people in Austin put up boxes, nest boxes for the screech owl, and so they just readily take to them. So, again, I'm not a big, manipulating the habitat, but I am okay with some management. So let's just say all the dead trees with woodpecker holes or natural holes were knocked down. Well, a nest box is a good, management and mitigation tool to put up to provide a nest site, because the small owls, the ones as big as your hand or so, are pretty much obligate cavity nesters. So they have to have a woodpecker hole or natural hole in the tree. And I know a number of people in Austin that have put up screech owl boxes, or you can say they're wood duck boxes, put them up in their yards, and the screech owls move right in and take them over and then nest in them.
What happens in an area where there's a bunch of owls versus not? How do they affect the rest of the wildlife in an area?
I'm not so sure of the interactions with all wildlife, but for the most part, I would say that the owls are good to have around. For, and many of the ranches here in Montana where we do research, they like the owls because they, the species that we work out here eat mostly, mice and voles and, small rodents that, the farmers and ranchers aren't so crazy about because they, eat their crops and things, or they wreck your lawn for sure. So in that sense, it might be good. They eat a lot of insects as well. So that might be very, very helpful. Sometimes, though, when the pygmy owl moves out of the mountains in the winter times and comes and hangs out of your bird feeder during the daytime and kills your chickadees and nuthatches, people aren't as crazy about that. But I have to remind them that they're still feeding birds. So that's how it works.
Oh, can you give them alternate things to eat, like lots of mice or something, so that they leave the other birds alone? They're like, are other birds their first snack, or is it like a last resort when there's nothing else?
No. I mean, it's kind of like a food preference thing. So many are just tied into small mammals. I mean, some of them are, 90% of their diet are just mice or voles or very, very small mammals, weighing, 30 grams or, an ounce or a little bit more than an ounce or 2 ounces or so. But some of them a little more specialized, like the pygmy owl I just spoke of. They're kind of a mix of they eat mammals and eat birds. So when they concentrate and they find a bird feeder, when someone's feeding birds, they'll hang out there and they'll pick birds off, as well as mice that might, forage underneath the feeder where seeds are dropping in the evening. So, it just kind of depends on the species. And some are very, very insectivorous. And, you may not get them at a feeder, but they'll hang out and maybe catch moths and other, nocturnal insects around your lights at night.
Are there any creatures that associate with them somewhat closely? Any symbiotic relationships, or were they kind of loners?
Here to think about symbiotic relations. There was a study in Texas. There was a suggestion that the owls brought in the Texas blind snake, I think it was, if I remember correctly, and would bring them into the nest, and the blind snake would eat all the parasites in the nest. And so they considered that a symbiotic relationship. But I think that was one study, and I think there's been a study maybe to support it and a study to refute it. But that's the one that comes to my mind as far as, symbiotic goes.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Are there anything that owls do that no other creature does that you've ever seen? No other bird? Anything like what would you say fascinates you about them most that most people don't even know that they do?
Oh, gosh. Couple of things fascinating. The vocalizations, they have a really diverse vocal repertoire. And, when I say the hooting and the tooting and the whistle, that's kind of like the primary songs, males trying to attract females for mating purposes. But there's all kinds of vocalizations. People just tend to hear the primary one during the breeding season. And for you, it's the barred owl in Texas, but it also could be the, the great horned owl. But if you're to work with them, and especially at a nest, then you hear all kinds of vocalizations as they try to defend the nest from researchers as well as potential predators. And I think that's kind of fascinating, the diversity of their voices. And I think that's probably has to do with most of them are nocturnal and nearly so. So communication is primarily through voice and not like display. And so males and females tend to look alike, and they're at night. So maybe, the male being one color and the female another color isn't as important maybe as the vocalizations are in social communication, mate attraction. So, which brings me to the other thing that's so neat is their camouflage coloration and patterning. They've evolved these colors that render them relatively inconspicuous during the daytime, kind of like the natural colors, if you will, the kind of grays and browns and light reds and light yellows and blackish. And then that helps them conceal themselves. And then the patterns on the feathers, look like bark or leaves or something like that. And then for those that have tufts on the heads, they raise their heads. So concealing themselves by day has always been very fascinating to me. And when I work with photographers and I say, take a picture of this, and you can hardly see it. Please take a picture. That's the one I want to show people what it's really like. Now, there is a caveat to that in something like the snowy owl up in the Arctic. So it has 24 hours of light. And so maybe like a male pheasant and a female pheasant, or a male duck and a female duck, the snowy owls are males and females as adults are distinctly different than each other. Males are primarily almost like a fluorescent white with a few spots, and females are a base white with many spots and bars. And if you think of that, why would that evolve? And, I thought about it and published a paper on it a year or so ago. And I think it has to do with that 24 hours of light. Vision is really important to them. Maybe some vocalizations, but vision is really important. Social communication. And one of the verses at nighttime in Texas, for example, hooting and tooting and whistling is probably important because, it's dark out. And so they don't have to evolve separate colors for each sex. And one of the things that buttresses our argument on that study is that we think it takes 4 to 5 or more years for males to become bright white. Prior to that, they kind of go through stages. They look like females, and then they start losing their spots, unless they're females. And they lose a few spots, but they stay spotted and barred. But one of the things we've learned over the years up there is that during the breeding season, only these bright white males breed. So if age and plumage are correlated, which it appears to be, that the older you get to a certain point and you turn all bright white, the females look like they're only breeding with older males with resources, or older white males with resources, versus younger males who kind of look like females who don't have resources or territories. And I think the evolution behind that is because of 24 hours of light.
Interesting. Are there any questions you're studying right now, research questions that you're maybe close to getting an answer on? Any breakthroughs? You're looking at owl DNA or the owl microbiome.
Yeah, we're doing a lot of that. We've done DNA, we've done hormone research. Breakthroughs. I'm not so sure about, here we are, the first to report this and that, which seems to be the goal of many. The long-term stuff is really what will stand the test of time. So, for example, in 2 of our studies, the snowy owl study I just spoke about has 34 years of data, and we can see a clear decline in the nesting numbers at our study area in Barrow, Alaska. But there's lots of fluctuations. So one year there's 15 nests, the next year there's none, the next year there's 20, the next year there's 5, the next year there's 25, the next year there's 3. But the trend line is significantly downward. Whereas in our other study here in Montana over 37 years, it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, but the regression line through it is very flat, indicating that if you were to study them like, the length of a typical graduate study, you might say, oh my God, they're doing great, or oh my God, they're declining. Oh my God, what's going on? But if you were to study them for the long term, you'd say, yeah, their populations fluctuate. Some years are great, other years are down. Most of the time it's medium with occasional high and occasional low. But over time, in this study area, the population seems stable. So that's the value of, long-term boots on the ground field research, which, the kids that work for me think I'm old school and I think they're new school, and we have different outlooks on it, so.
Maybe you should have a group that goes out called Boots on the Ground. And they go.
Well, I argue that. I'm arguing that right now that we're kind of moving away from boots on the ground. And I think as we use more and more technology, which has been super helpful for many things, but the one drawback that I see is we now are kind of moved towards being inference biologists, where we go on for a very short period of time. We gather some information, maybe we put a satellite transmitter on something, and then we go sit at a computer. We make inferences on the movements. There's some neat stuff to be learned from that, but we can't abandon the boots on the ground because you actually need some observations to go with your inferences.
Last question. So do owls interact with bats, or are there any other creatures that either annoy owls or compete with them for space or try to kill them and eat them?
Well, yeah, a couple questions in there. The bat question, we randomly find when we do the food habits analysis, so we, collect the regurgitated pellets very often or debris from the nest sites. And every now and then we find bats, not in the species we work with, not very often, but there's an owl down in Mexico and Central America called the Stygian owl, and it seems to eat a few more bats than most other species. So I could see that, for sure that some species may specialize on certain prey, and that's what gets them by. Not that they don't eat other things. The snowy owl and the lemming is like your classic, media story that snowy owls are tied into lemmings, and when lemmings are high, snowy owls are good breeding year. When lemmings decline, snowy owls may not nest. And there's a fair amount of truth to that.
Interesting. Well, what do you think is going to be the future of owl research? Are you gearing up for any interesting experiments?
Well, right now, there's a couple things that are kind of taking the forefront. A lot of our work has been very, species specific. in trying to understand the life histories of, a fair number of species that we work on. But I think as I'm getting older here, I'm trying to look at some of the bigger pictures. And we have a couple of things that are going on here. One is the conservation. Habitat's the most important thing everywhere. I mean, that's the bottom line. And we do protect a lot of habitat, but you still have to know what's going on. You can't just say, we're going to protect, 1 million acres and then not do anything about it. You got to go in and find out, well, how are the animals doing over time? One of the things that we're working on right now, which I think is a big issue, is the conservation of snags, or, that doesn't sound familiar to dead and decaying trees for owls and other wildlife. We're concentrating on owls. So we're trying to get together with, private landowners, Forest Service, people who own tracts of timber, or just, timber on their private lands, and say, these dead trees that we tend to take down for a variety of reasons. So some are legitimate, maybe something is a safety hazard or it's diseased and all that, but we want to try to get the message out that many of these dead trees are very, very important to owls. So there's about, kind of depends who has the list, let's say 260 to 70 species of owls in the world. Over half of them are pretty much dependent on dead or decaying trees or cavities, either made by woodpeckers, natural holes in trees, or the broken tops of trees. So that's a pretty big conservation issue because not a lot of people know about that. I just gave a talk to the Montana Tree Growers Association, and we talked about the number of species that were dependent on dead trees, and many of the landowners came up and said, I had no idea of that, and you gave us some good photographs and some insight. We're going to try to save a few more trees. And now we're trying to take that to a broader geographic level or a national level, and save some of those trees, for not only owls, but, there's bats that use them. There's, squirrels that use them. There's insects that use them. There's 80 plus species of birds that use natural holes in trees and things like that. So that's a big issue for us. The conservation in the Arctic, Arctic's warming up, fairly quickly. If you work up there, you definitely see it. And so what's happening to lemmings will definitely affect the conservation of snowy owls. So we have, in addition to our 34 years of snowy owl research, we have 32 years of lemming sampling to look at that correlation to what's going on there. So, a lot of things like that, habitat conservation, and, that's kind of like where I'm moving into, or reviews of what makes owls so cool, things like that sort. The species stuff, very important. Long-term data, very important. The stress on long-term data, and that's another thing. I just wrote a paper on, expertise and expert performance. And we tend to just do slam bam research studies. That's kind of the way of, that's the system. And I'm, I'm an advocate of we need to change the system instead of all these 1 to 3 season graduate studies, and then people stop and move on, and the next group comes up. We need long-term data sets, because that's the only ones that are going to stand the test of time. That's the only one's going to give us information on populations and doing so. But that's a tough battle to fight, because the system is geared towards, how many papers can I publish? And so the short-term studies result in numerous papers, and, we tend to publish fewer papers, but based on longer-term, more detailed research.
Okay. Well, very good, Denver. What's the best place for people to find out more about your work and, see videos or learn about the owls and how you work with them?
Yeah. Go to our website, owlinstitute.org. And we have a series of live cams up. We'll be trying to put one up in the Arctic here in the next 3 weeks or so on a snowy owl nest. But people can see the lives of owls with the cams, and we work with explore.org out of California, in a partnership where we find the nests and they provide the live cams, and then we're able to do, we're able to do research, we're able to inform the public, we're able to do education programs, and open up kind of like if you want to say, the secret lives of owls to the public who doesn't know much about them or get a chance to see them. So go to the Owl Institute's website, and then, we're always looking for stuff, donate to us. We take everything. Someone just called up and donated a Suburban yesterday, and which we need. Now we got a new trailer for 4-wheelers today. We need money for research. You need a house and barrow to continue snowy owls. So go on our site and help support our work.
Okay, well, very good. Thank you, Denver, for coming on the podcast. And I think it's just fascinating. So I appreciate all everything you've said. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.